All right, let me begin by welcoming you guys. Thank you for coming to the Willard W. Brown International Business Leadership Series. Today's focus is on climate change in emerging economies with focus on Africa. My name is Sherwat. I'm Associate Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at the School of Business. I'm also the director of the MBA and the Executive MBA programs. I'd like to begin by welcoming our speakers, Mr. Epstein, a philosopher and energy expert. Epstein argues that human flourishing should be the guiding principle of industrial and environmental progress. He's the author of the new book, Fossil Future, and the 2014 New York bestseller, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Alex has made his moral case for fossil fuels at dozens of campuses, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke, his alma mater, and we're very happy to add to it AUC. All right, Dr. Moataz Darwish, energy consultant, lecturer, and facilitator on strategy and entrepreneurship. Dr. Darwish here combines 20 plus years in energy, of which he spent 16 with the Royal Dutch Shell, and the last 5 as Deputy Country Chair and Government and Corporate Affairs Director for Shell companies in Egypt. Prior, he was based in the Netherlands as the Commercial Manager for the UK Southern North Sea in NAM. Previously, he was Country Commercial Director, Executive Team Member, and Board Director for Nat Gas and Maria companies. All right, so let's begin today's session. It's kind of a debate. We're going to go around with a couple of questions to each of the speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please do keep your questions handy when we need them. To kick it off, I want to acknowledge the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, recently highlighted areas that need specific focus for Africa, okay, or for developing countries. That will be the focus of COP27. Emission reductions, adapting to impacts of climate change, and climate finance, right? At COP26, actually, governments agreed on the need to provide more support to developing countries and called for adaptation finance to be doubled. We will get to the whole mitigation versus adaptation discussion hopefully later on today, but to kick it off, Alex, you often express that instilling that kind of fear, right, is not the best way to go about the climate discussion, and you advocate human flourishing. It should be the forefront of industrial development and environmental progress. You talk about human well-being, life expectancy, fulfillment, all these aspects. How do you frame that in the context of Africa and emerging economies?
Okay, I forget. I think we said we each had 10 minutes at the beginning. Is that right?
I'd like to make 8 and 8, and then maybe 6 and 6. So we allow.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Alex Epstein. Very happy to be here. So just to focus it in terms of what I'm interested in talking about and what we discussed on the phone in terms of debate, it's the core of it is, should Africa pursue net zero policies? There is a global push. She mentioned the framework for climate change, the IPCC, all of these things, COP26, of course, COP27 coming up, are pushing toward rapidly eliminating emissions, get to global net zero by 2050. And there's this question of, should Africa pursue this? And my answer is, African nations absolutely need to reject these policies 100%. These policies in small doses so far are already harming Africa and the rest of the world dramatically. In larger doses, they will do far greater harm to the world, especially to Africa. And I'm going to advocate that African nations stand up for their right to pursue the same policy that the most developed nations have, which is to use all cost-effective sources of energy, including fossil fuels. And I'm going to share 3 facts that I think very strongly point in the direction of this. And I'll summarize them and then I'll elaborate. So fact 1 is wealthy countries have overwhelmingly developed using fossil fuels and continue to dominantly use fossil fuels, whether or not they have fossil fuel resources. Fact 2 is wealthy countries attempt to even partially replace fossil fuels with solar and wind following net zero policies have already led to skyrocketing energy costs and now a global energy crisis. And then fact 3, dealing with the pretext of all of this, is that fossil fuel development has not caused a climate crisis. It has actually made humanity far safer. So just elaborate on those, and I'm sure more will come up. But so first, wealthy countries have overwhelmingly developed fossil fuels. and continue to dominantly use fossil fuels, whether or not they have fossil fuel resources. I think it's really important because in Africa, as most places, people are really interested in development. And I think when you're looking at development, you have to look at what has worked in other places and what is working now. And so this is probably common sense to most people here. It's not in America, but development, we don't think enough about energy, but development requires cost-effective energy. By that, I mean it needs to be affordable, reliable, versatile, so it can power everything, not just electricity, and scalable. It needs to be able to provide energy for billions of people in thousands of places. The fact is today, fossil fuels are by far the most cost-effective source of energy. They provide 80% of the world's energy, and they are growing fast, particularly in the parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, such as China. Very important, because we'll talk about different African nations probably, even in places with no resources, fossil fuels have been the key to development and prosperity. So South Korea, for example, no significant resources, and yet is over 80% fossil fuels, has become prosperous. Japan, almost 90% fossil fuels. Singapore, over 95% fossil fuels. So here we have very clear examples of places that have developed with unbelievable success using fossil fuels because they chose to use the most cost-effective form of energy. As that evolves over time, by the way, you want to use whatever is most cost-effective, but today and going forward, in most situations, fossil fuels are the most cost-effective option. And then, of course, when you do have fossil fuel resources, many African nations have, these benefits even increase. So you take, say, the United States, Canada, Norway, these are all places that have compounded their prosperity with large amounts of domestic fossil fuel production. So that's fact. This is a key part of development that works very, very well. Fact two is wealthy countries' attempt to even partially replace fossil fuels with solar and wind have led to skyrocketing costs and now a global energy crisis. You hear people say, well, you should use renewables, you should use solar and wind. Well, you need to look at how is this actually working out in the world today, because we've had promises in the wealthier parts of the world, solar and wind are going to rapidly replace fossil fuels. And what's happened in practice is solar and wind, because they're unreliable, have this problem where they can go near zero at any given time. It can last quite a while. And so what happens is that adds to the cost of energy, because you still need 100% reliable energy, and then you add the solar and wind on top of that. So many cost estimates you see of solar and wind don't look at the full cost of the energy, including backing it up. They just look at the cost of the solar panels or wind turbines, and that is very, very misleading. So what we've seen in the wealthier world is using this, the cost of fossil fuels, the cost of renewables rather, have added to the cost of energy, but also because the renewables have been justified by restricting fossil fuels, which is of course what net zero is all about. The main thing that's happened that's really disastrous is they've made fossil fuels far more expensive than they need to be. In the wealthier world in particular, we have restricted fossil fuel investment, fossil fuel development, fossil fuel transport, and this has only been a tiny fraction of what the net zero movement wants. We're considered way behind our goals, and yet we have a global energy crisis. This not only makes energy more expensive, but it makes everything more expensive. So I've been talking to people in Egypt about, say, food, and you're feeling, from what I understand, people are feeling the cost of food prices going up, which is a lot driven by energy prices going up, such as fertilizer prices, fuels for machinery, and people paying 3 times more for food than they were not too long ago. This is the way in which this whole net zero agenda is already adversely affecting Africa in extremely negative ways. So if we hear advocacy, if you need to replace fossil fuels with solar and wind, you need to look at what has actually worked and what is actually failing. What's happening right now is the wealthier parts of the world are now retreating from this anti-fossil fuel agenda. So the United States, President Biden ran on, I guarantee you we will end fossil fuel. Now he's begging everyone around the world for more fossil fuels. Europe is now talking about more natural gas, more LNG imports. So this agenda that you hear so much about, that the world is transitioning, it's not true. There's no energy transition. We haven't reduced fossil fuels overall. We've actually been increasing them overall. We've just been adding other things. So there's an energy addition, not a transition. And even then, we haven't added enough fossil fuel. And that's why we have this crisis. So you have to ask, when people are saying, you should do a far, far more extreme version of what the wealthiest parts of the world are doing and suffering massively and retreating from, why in the world should this be applied to Africa? And then the third point, which is important just as background, is the whole justification of let's get rid of fossil fuels by 2050, let's force it. It's important this is being forced on people. It's not just a superior competitor, is that this alleged climate crisis. We can go into details, but the fact that people don't mention, the UN doesn't mention, is when you actually measure our safety from climate. So how many people are dying from climate-related disasters? There's no crisis. The rate of climate-related disaster deaths is down 98% over the last 100 years. And it's because of fossil fuel development. It's because of heating, air conditioning, irrigation, drought relief convoys. We're far safer from climate than ever. And if we keep developing, we will be far safer still. Yes, we have a warming impact on the climate, but that is not a catastrophe. We still have far more cold-related deaths in the world and warm-related deaths even in places like India. And so if you recognize these three facts, that fossil fuels are crucial to development, that attempting to get off fossil fuels has been disastrous even for the wealthy parts of the world that they're retreating, and that fossil fuel development has not caused a climate crisis, it's made us far safer from climate. I think the obvious conclusion is African nations need to use all cost-effective sources of energy and not accept any net zero targets whatsoever. That doesn't mean you can't use solar. That means you only use solar as and when it's cost-effective. We're going to talk about some of the details of that. I think it's really important to publicly and proudly state this, particularly at COP27. There's a lot of pressure on Africa to follow really, really bad policies that are failing in the rest of the world that will be far more damaging here and are already damaging here through rising commodity prices and food prices. And this is going to sound very controversial, but I think ultimately, whether it's a COP27 or elsewhere, African nations should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And if you think this is like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? We see how weak the climate catastrophe net zero world is. Again, America and the European Union are already retreating from their anti-fossil fuel policies, yet they're still trying to force them on the poorest parts of the world. That's immoral, but it's also weak. If African nations stand up and say, we will not accept this, we do not accept these goals, we are going to empower people as quickly as possible through the most cost-effective source of energy, including fossil fuels. That's the #1 priority. Energy will evolve over time. We'll use better sources of energy as they're available, but we're going to use the most cost-effective. The rest of the world is not going to be able to stand up to that. They're going to be afraid, and you will do yourselves a great service, and you'll do the world a great service. Part of the reason I'm here is because I think African nations are being very unjustly treated by the rest of the world, but also I think this is the best hope to stand up to this very destructive net zero movement.
Thank you. All right. So interesting point here. We have this issue of when you bring the net zero plans, to Africa, how should we react from a policy perspective? But I think we chatted before that there's this whole holistic or systems thinking approach to the problem where you look at especially the issues with Africa in my opening statement, again, on adaptation, what should the continent do, the just transition movement, right? So in other words, not all communities are affected equally. Our share in global warming, again, is very minimal compared to what's expected of us. How do we respond to these issues again, how fair it comes to Africa? In spite of all the discussions acknowledged already by you and FCCC about just transition, right? It's not the first time we see viewpoints like what Alex is raising here. This has been discussed again in COP26. It was controversial. I think that's why they responded with this call about adaptation, and maybe we can even explain what adaptation and mitigation is, and we can take it from there.
So let me start by explaining that I'm not here I'm not fully against Alex, but I really disagree with him on fundamental issues. So let's put the context in place. So when we talk about prosperity and welfare, Africa did not get its fair share at all with fossil fuel. So the fossil fuel never delivered it. And I'm not saying that renewables will, but what we've seen so far is totally unjust. So let me try to get you all engaged here. What do you think is the vaccination penetration for COVID in Africa was, percentage-wise?
8%. 8%.
Okay, so WHO is saying 15 now. Again, if you exclude North Africa and some other countries in Africa, this is really a disgrace. Huh? So this is where it's really telling that when when push comes to shove, Africa is left. And I think Alex sort of alluded to that, so everybody should do the. Again, just transition is fundamental. We're not saying here that Africa should go by itself to net zero. It has to be in the context of a just transition that captures the support and the funding from the people and the West who actually caused the problem. Because we all know that Africa is not giving its share of CO2 emissions anyway. It's 3% of the global contribution to CO2 emissions. Again, let's go back and ask another probably very telling metric. What is the electricity penetration in Africa? Any guess there? And that's with all the goods of fossil fuel promises. Electricity penetration in Africa. Any views? Huh?
Less than 50%.
So you don't tell me that fossil fuel delivered that. And I think, and I blame the states in Africa, of course, and governments and everything, but I also blame international oil companies because they go for the exploitation and not sustainable development. I've seen it. I mean, you go there, you find the big gas finding, instead of building the infrastructure and delivering gas and electrifying the country, you go for LNG export. And that's the model. And that's not just again. So net zero needs to be just, or else fossil fuel needs to be just. And I'm not talking against companies only, I'm talking about the whole system is not just. And Africa is really left to take the bad side of things. Another thing I want to highlight is that what fossil fuel fundamentally, the business model is, it's very useful, especially for students to understand. So fossil fuel model is high capex, high risk, high tech, and it's getting harder and more technical as we go. So easy oil, as at least the IOCs have been saying for years now, easy oil is out. So we're talking about more complication, more difficult access, deep water, fracking, all these kind of things, plus very high risk. And labor light, especially in the operational side, life cycle. And that's not helping a lot with prosperity when it comes to Africa. If you look at the renewables model, you're talking about labor intensive. You're talking about off-grid solutions, which is very useful for the demography and geography of Africa. And again, every country has its own case. If we talk Egypt, it's different than different countries, different than Libya, different than South Africa. So generalization, and that's probably one of my biggest problems with Alex's claims, is that it's not granular enough. And I understand that he's pitching a macro pitch, but it doesn't work, especially if you want to get to real solutions. It has to be granular to the country. So in that sense, I disagree with the claim of Alex on that. Although I agree with him that full cost is important, but I will add to that, it has to be an economic cost, not only a commercial cost. So we need to capture unemployment factor. We need to capture the environmental, the social impact, everything, energy accessibility, fairness and justice. So it's not only about cost per se, and of course it has to be life cycle, absolutely, but economically, not only so that's another. So to conclude, I think I'm running out of time. Yes, Africa needs to push for this agenda, absolutely, but it has to push conditional on support just transition. And fossil fuel to continue needs to get its act together. Decarbonization, commitment to sustainable development, not wishy-washy with addressing CSR programs, not delivering anything. And they can do that. And I've seen good models. So yes, fossil fuel, but conditional as well. Net zero, yes, conditional as well. That's an innovation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Relating to what again Moataz is saying here, you've been advocating this for more than 10 years, right?
Yes.
Right. And again, yet major actions and steps were taken towards, at least in the US, right? Better air pollution, better cleaner water, and benefits you've been reaping as a flourishing human. benefits of actions that actually make your quality of life better in that sense. And if you look at the oil industry again, it picked up what the first well was 1859. It took 90 years for oil after World War II to reach where it is today as a, something consumable to affect our prices or our daily lives. So don't you think you want to give at least, I know you're always, one of the arguments you make is that, it's expensive, it's not reliable, it's inefficient for renewable energies. Don't you think that you need to give at least, that kind of long view for renewables in a country where, again, in a business school here, we teach technology adoption, network externalities. When more people use a certain technology, it becomes cheaper. So how do you, position that since that you actually benefit? How do you get the best of both worlds? Growing renewables while still holding your views.
So I just want to step back. So I don't think any of my points have been addressed, and I try to make, and I think I've put forward a policy, and I had 3 points, and I don't think the policy has been, there's been an alternative policy, and I don't think any points. So again, the policy is Africa should demand to use the most cost-effective source of energy. That can include solar where it's actually cost-effective. The fact one is this works around the world, and it has worked in places that were extremely poor pretty recently, like Singapore, and became wealthy. So if there are issues in Africa with fossil fuels, which I'm sure there are, I know some of them, but those are issues of implementation, not issues of the fuel is a problem. And so, but just to reiterate, and then number two is these solar and wind policies is not some brand new fantastic idea that hasn't been tried. This is being tried, and it is failing around the world. And then again, the climate crisis, and we don't have a climate crisis, we're impacting it, but we're actually safer than ever for the climate. So in terms of how we think about things like renewables, it's much better to think about we want the most cost-effective sources of energy, and we want energy to evolve. So I reject this idea of a transition to net zero, and calling it a just transition doesn't change anything, because the goal is still net zero, and that is still a goal that will kill billions of people prematurely, whether you call it just or not. So there is no such thing as a just transition to net zero in any near future, least of all for Africa. So you should reject that and embrace the idea of energy evolution, which means energy can get better, but you need to rapidly expand energies, particularly in the poorest parts. This transition was come up with by people who are against the expansion of energy and that it shouldn't be there. In terms of renewables, you shouldn't favor renewables. Why would you favor renewables? You should favor what's cost effective. So for example, nuclear has way more demonstrated potential than solar and wind. Nuclear has provided low cost, reliable energy 50 years ago in the world until the green movement made it incredibly expensive by demonizing it and virtually criminalizing it. So that's one thing, is we should have more nuclear development around. There are other promising things such as deep geothermal, which you can call renewable. So I'm all for these things competing, but they should compete. And in terms of this idea that, oh, well, we need to give them special favors, oil dominated the industry within 2 years of coming on the market. It came on the market in 1859. By 1861, it was beginning to dominate. When you have truly superior solutions, they scale and people will invest a lot of money in them. So the fact that renewables, particularly solar and wind, are having all of these problems isn't the most promising thing in the world, and they should have to prove themselves. And already they get incredible special privileges, and they're still leading to all these problems. So, but in any case, do not force them on yourselves and don't force them on anyone else. They can compete, great, but you should not be restricting fossil fuels at all in the name of these are going to replace them.
Okay, so we have a tone here about should you force it or not, which we can also discuss, but do you want to address the whole issue about how renewables might be the future main source of energy for Africa?
Let me first answer the cost effective. I think we're avoiding it. So cost effective does not mean all cost. It should also mean the whole economic case. And we're trying to avoid that. So affordability, accessibility, people welfare from revenues of fossil fuel. I mean, it's not only about cost.
If you think I'm avoiding it, I'm happy to address that directly,
sure.
but there are just more important things that you left out, so I need to
Yeah,
address those
okay.
first.
So let me ask, and nuclear, I mean, that's probably a very interesting debate in the West, and they can entertain themselves there. In Africa, nuclear, seriously? I mean, we've been trying in Egypt to build one plant for 50 years. Talking about technology transfer, politics, all sorts of ugly truths out there, right? So, and again, delivering it to 1.5 billion people, fueling it on nuclear, that's a very hard case. I'm not against nuclear, but I don't see it happening. I mean, with building it in digital ages, and it's not happening. Well, it is happening, I hope, in a few years, but again, how big is that to fuel an economy of 100 million, let alone 1.5 billion? Renewables, again, I don't know what you're saying. Renewables is failing. I'm not sure what's the evidence there. I mean, it's there. It's the cost is dropping like a rock. With competing on $100 barrel, I think anybody can beat $100 barrel. It's about volume and it's about intermittency, and I understand that, and probably with some technical penetration things will get fixed. And again, that's why we call it transition, we call it evolution. And absolutely with net zero, it's better off for Africa. If you fund it, if you put the adaptation and the mitigation in the right context. I'm very skeptical on whether the West will deliver on that, because they've never delivered in the past on any other thing. But that's the advocacy stance Africa should take.
So in terms of the cost effective, I think I'm really highlighting the success stories for reasons. If you ask what have been the benefits in Singapore, so Singapore over 95%, Japan almost 90%, South Korea over 80% phosphorus. These are places, I mean, you can add the US as well, but those are places that don't even have the resource and they're benefiting so much from it. So we know that with the right policies, fossil fuels have incredible benefits, and that's why they're being used so widely. So to point to, this is, I have this new book, Fossil Future, one of the chapters I talk about the abuse-use fallacy. So this is to say, this is the fallacy that, well, if you can abuse something, if it can be misused, then we shouldn't do it at all. And so if you're saying, well, in Africa, in some ways, it's being misused, okay, but then use it properly. But the formula for success today is to use fossil fuels. And in terms of the cost of these things, I mentioned before, you have to look at the full cost of things. With solar, you always have to look at the cost of backup. Also, it's not true that they're still falling like a rock. They've been rising recently, in part because they are dependent on a lot of factors, including Chinese slave labor, low Chinese environmental standards. There are a bunch of supply chain issues with them. And the reason solar panels are getting so cheap, in large part, is they're produced by China with those issues, along with a lot of coal. So China is using coal to produce solar and wind, and is telling the rest of the world to use. So I maintain what I've said about these policies are failing. The other thing is the biggest policy failure is restricting fossil fuels in the name of these things. That's why oil prices have gone up so much. That's why natural gas prices particularly have gone up so much, coal prices. So I don't know how after all of that, you can say we should be positioned for net zero. And if you think Africa is going to get some magical favors from the world, it wasn't happening in 2019 when the world was wealthy. Now we have a net zero induced energy crisis where people are so concerned about their own pocketbooks, they're not going to give this aid anyway. And it wouldn't be very useful if they did, because what is needed in every country that succeeds in development is using the most cost-effective forms of energy to develop successfully. It's not a bunch of wealth transfers and subsidies.
Okay, so let me take it back again. So we know that the continents, the problems of Africa, for example, informal sector, we're trying a lot of policies at the macro level, promote entrepreneurship, and again, the whole talk about investing, I would say not just grant money, but real finance, of green finance up to 1 billion per year, right? Between now and 2005, it seems to be discussions going up to 4 billion, I guess, again, towards 2025, right? So what is, again, I'm trying to really understand here, what could be the possible harm when you have a continent that has a huge informal sector looking for new innovative business ideas, not wanting to copycat Singapore, Korea, the models you present, but wanting to stand on their own feet with their own investments and their own technologies that are homegrown and doing some kind of hopefully leapfrogging. I think we have this in some industries, right? So go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, leapfrogging is a term I like to use as well, because an analogy I always take is the telecom industry. So Africa has been lagging behind big time. So no infrastructure, very little infrastructure, and whatnot. And now there is the big wave that is promoting entrepreneurship, off-grid solutions, and the likes. So it's very prudent to pick this way. And again, we're talking about an advocacy stance. You're saying advocacy stance is to reject it. I think that's totally absurd. I mean, advocacy stance is to adopt it conditionally and negotiate. That's where it comes to. And try to ride the wave of bypassing the gap in infrastructure over the years and the unjust treatment over the years by picking up this new business model that hopefully will pick up on entrepreneurship and people taking matters in their hand versus state routines and whatnot, especially with the geography and the demography of Africa. That is more prone towards the renewable model than the fossil fuel. Again, fossil fuel can deliver. If they can deliver on decarbonization, on fair technology transfer that they lack for years, be it. I mean, they can be part of the mix. We know the pie is growing. We know there is room for everything, but it has to be just. There has to be better models, improved fossil fuel models going forward. I mean, even oil companies are saying that. They've adopted these strategies. They all have, not all, but most of them have the energy transition plans and strategies, and they're going about doing it. And so advocating against it, I think it's past that point, and it's part of the reality now. We need to move forward with better strategies, and decarbonization is the name of the game.
I mean, I see it like, when I teach in class, the Kodak example where, when there used to be chemical photography, but now if they had moved, at that time to digital photography, things would have been different for them. So it's a good chance for even oil companies to see this change and this disruption happening and trying to see where they go from here. That's one.
Well,
okay.
I just think this is all based on imagination. So this is why I'm trying to focus on reality. So let's take what's happening in China. So China is the world's leading producer of renewables. And what do they use to produce renewables? They use solar? No, they use coal to produce renewables. So again, the basic situation is you are being told to, in one way or another, forcibly restrict yourself from using fossil fuels, which are clearly the path to development for everyone who's actually succeeded, and everyone is using them today. And you're being told to replace them with these things that are having failures around the world, and certainly on their own don't support anyone anywhere. These are just the facts. So you're being told to do something, the most reckless thing imaginable that no one else in the world is doing. And it's being pitched as, oh, isn't this an exciting entrepreneurial opportunity? Well, guess what? If it's an exciting opportunity, don't accept the force. See if it works. If Moataz has all these brilliant ideas, he can start a company. I know he worked in oil before, but he can start a new solar company. And if it has fantastic success, I will celebrate that. I will promote it, say, look, this was amazing. This is an example of cost-effective energy. But the context is the world is telling you do not use fossil fuels, and you need to reject that. That is a deadly order that is being pushed, and the rest of the world is not following. Again, we are already in the West backtracking on our commitments. We've been breaking all the commitments. And just one more thing about the models. I don't know what it means. It's too vague to say we want to stand on our own 2 feet. We don't want to do what Singapore did. You always want to learn from what people did that worked. So whatever you do, it needs to work, because if you don't develop, lots of people die prematurely and don't have opportunities. So I think there is a lot to learn from all of these success stories.
And Kim, thank you for bringing them in. Of course, they're always, it's schooling here. So definitely on that one, with I think that holistic approach that you've been maybe, because of your efforts, right, have been acknowledged by FCC about the holistic approach, systems thinking, how you not just look at environment, but look at everything else. They're actually the ones suggesting this to the discussion. It's not like, it is a homegrown movement, I have to say, from South Africa, the just transition concept, but it's very well acknowledged. Adaptation actually is on the lead investment. And adaptation has to do with, if some of you are new to this topic again, where the continent, again, the fact that the equator passes through here, we are the ones suffering from the major parts of, what's happening, whether it's drought, whether it's too much water, too little water, and acknowledging and waiting when things hit like a hurricane or something for altruism or for someone to donate money should not be the case. Again, what we're trying to promote here is that why don't we have a fund for adaptation of climate change? If you're going to ask us to do this 1, 2, 3, and the 1, 2, 3 happens to be on our good side. So I really don't see how it might not work.
You see, all of this is, I keep saying this, but I don't agree with transition. I don't agree with just transition. I think just transition is just a euphemism. The UN is not considering the benefits of fossil fuels. I've read a lot of their reports, even the multi-thousand-page reports. They don't talk about the benefits of fossil fuels. They don't talk about the fact that we're safer than ever from climate. This is an organization that is obsessed with eliminating our emissions at all costs, which are massive human costs. So, and so it's not enough to just say, oh, we want a just transition for all the reasons that I've said.
Okay, we're going to open to the audience in a minute, but Alex, again, as a philosopher, you want to understand that we had, to have a movement against oil companies, which is a major capital force, you need to take that strong stance on the other extreme side. So when it lets go a little bit, you end up in the middle, right? So what you're talking about, you benefit from air pollution, better air, better quality of life because of the standards that have been imposed by these standards.
So the issue is, when you're saying you use cost-effective energy and have good policies, yes, all the examples I've given have standards for things like air pollution. Those are good things to have if they're done in the right way. I am not saying, did I say at all, Africa should not have standards for air pollution? No, what I said is Africa should accept no restrictions from this imperialistic net zero movement that's saying don't use fossil fuels. What I keep saying is you should use the most cost-effective sources of energy. Do not in any way accept any restrictions or hostility toward fossil fuel use. That's way different than using it. The other thing, this is going to be controversial, but I think there is a big, with things both of you have said, there's a victim mentality I think is very dangerous. So poverty is not just the result of injustice. Everyone is poor, okay? Poverty is the norm. 200 years ago, everyone in the world was poor. Singapore was poor fairly recently. The way you get out of poverty is you need to pass certain policies and you need to use a lot of energy. And so it's not, there have been many injustices done to African nations, but that doesn't change the fact that every nation is responsible for passing policies and adopting practices that make it rich. And if anyone is waiting, I don't think here, but if anyone is waiting for the rest of the world to give some handout or apology that's going to fix things, that's not the way it's going to work. That's why I'm in favor of these models. It's possible to go from poverty to prosperity very, very quickly. And that's what I wish for everyone.
All right, so we want to make this in a way organized. I'll begin with Nell. Raise your hand if you have a question so I can plan for the time properly. Okay, we'll begin by Nelly. I'll hope I get to everyone, but allow me to go around the. Go ahead.
Hi, so I think just to put things in context, so I mean in Africa as a continent, 600 million people have no electricity, a third of people are in extreme poverty, so that's less than $1.90 a day. By 2050, there's predictions that the population will be 2.5 billion. So I think just a couple of things. So, you say in Africa that they shouldn't rely on fossil fuels. Now, a lot of countries in Africa have gone, you say not only fossil fuels, so coal, for example. So we should use coal, for example. So you say China has become prosperous because of coal. Keeping in mind that China is the biggest, with America, the biggest polluter of all pollution. So, and then you also say that we shouldn't have the victim mentality. Okay, so the US, the UK, so much of those countries were actually founded on slavery. I say this as somebody being half English, half Egyptian with African roots as well. So to say that countries shouldn't play the victim mentality, even though colonialism, we know, had a direct impact on many African countries. We know dependency theory is proven time and time again, that many countries have been importing goods and services and labor and slavery until not so long ago and also currently. And these countries have been disproportionately affected. So the UN, they put a big reserve for African countries, yet when things aren't going their way, they say we'll cut money off, even though to Russia, they don't say that as well. So I think the fact that, you say that African countries can prosper, it's really not that straightforward when we have a third of people living in extreme poverty, keeping in mind that African countries are disproportionately affected by climate change because of, drought and hunger and all of these sorts of things. The second point is about coal. So,
5 points.
yeah, so I'm sure you can keep track, you're a philosopher.
Limited time, but sure.
So I grew up partly in a mining town, and many children in my town actually suffered from neurological problems because of coal, carcinogenics, learning disabilities, autism. America has almost 4,000 towns and cities that have suffered from coal and lead and other kind of fossil fuels as well. So I think from you use the word altruism. So from a moral perspective, then, if we're to continue the use of coal and other fuels like that, how can we do that. You know, we can't say that everything that is natural is good when we know that there's direct links to neurological problems. So I think those 2 points about you say, oh, we can go from poverty to prosperity, and then this point about how can a government be morally responsible if we're using things that are directly linked to deaths and neurological problems?
Okay, so the poverty to prosperity. So I was born in 1980. In 1980, 42% of the world lived on less than $2. Now it's 10%. So we have, that is the greatest improvement in poverty in the history of the world. So we know it is possible. Places that are desperately poor can become rich. And I would just say, again, like, you want to look as much as possible to the different models of how it's done. Again, people are coming from desperate poverty and becoming wealthy, so that we know that it's doable. I've elaborated on that, but it's that. And in terms of how can you do something that's harmful, so with all these technologies, there are better and worse ways of using them. So one question is, are you abusing them? But when you're looking at anything, one key methodological point is you always need to carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects. So if you want to say, oh, well, this community is harmed by coal, people say, well, China, you know, Shanghai is harmed by coal. And yet they have life expectancy well over 75 because there have been so many benefits, even though I would say their policies are not right. They could be having a lot cleaner air, but you cannot in good conscience outlaw something whose benefits far, far outweigh its side effects because you end up killing people. So it's really a bad thinking when people do what you're talking about, or what you're exhibiting, I should say, which is just focusing on negatives and often exaggerating them and acting like they can't be solved and ignoring the huge positives. If you look at Fossil Future, happy to send you a copy. Chapter 4, what you see, fossil fuel use is like this, life expectancy is like this, income is like this, population is like this, and they're not just random correlations. It's because fossil fuels make us incredibly productive and prosperous. Okay, let's address this one thing.
Can you correlate that with life age? So we can say that like cannabis is great for us, but long term, it's really not.
That analogy, I didn't even understand the plausibility of that analogy.
It's very plausible if you look at the neurological developments.
Okay, so I explained, it's what fossil fuels enable you to do, what energy does, what fossil fuels are uniquely cost effective is they enable you to use machines to become productive and prosperous. So when you can do that, you have things like incubators because you have reliable electricity. You have industrial farming, so you can produce 1,000 times the food per person that a manual laborer can do. So let's talk about this issue because I've heard 3 people now say this, despite the fact I already gave you the empirical data on this. Climate-related disaster deaths globally are down 98% over the last century. That includes Africa. Africa is part of the globe. The average person is 1/50th as likely to die from a climate-related disaster. Africa is infinitely better off climate-wise than it was 50 years ago, in part because a lot of these changes are exaggerated, but in part because there's huge innovations that have benefited everyone in the world. Not enough in Africa, true, but African life expectancy has gone up dramatically. And things like drought. Drought used to be a huge killer, and now we have drought relief, including from the wealthier parts of the world that can alleviate a lot of suffering. So it's not true that Africa is this victim of climate. That's not the problem. What Africa is the victim of right now is the net zero movement. That is where all my sympathy is, because we have the imperialist people in the net zero movement telling Africa, do this. And it's really sad to me that we have people in Africa that are complicit with this and saying, oh, this is great, this is innovation, this is like cell phones. This is not like cell phones. Cell phones were not mandated and you got rid of the other thing before you had a proven replacement. So you gotta reject this whole movement. That's the imperialism, that's the injustice. Interesting point, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for the interesting debate so far. My own comments or question, I would say, when I look at transition conversations or decarbonization as it were, I bring it down to Africa, how it impacts Africa. My starting point would be that Africa is at the receiving end on all fronts. The direct fiscal consequences of climate change are evident here in Africa, and they are attributed to industrial activities outside the continent. The other point that relates to Africa is that there are peculiar development needs that are evident in Africa that raises a lot of questions. One, I'll try to put my points in 3 buckets. I'll look at the development and welfare considerations, I'll look at technology, and I'll also look at industrialization. In the context of development today, if you look at the conversation around transition or decarbonization, Bringing it down to the continent, we have about 10 energy, fossil fuel endowed and highly dependent economies who are challenged by peculiar issues of development related to poverty, unemployment, poverty, disease, and squalor. And these countries are dependent on resources from fossil fuel related sources to serve as catalysts for their development. So when I hear conversations about by 2050, we should achieve net zero, the question is, what will be the fate of these countries in the short to medium term? There are no options that have been provided. I'll talk to the other point on industrialization. If you look at Africa today, compare Africa to the rest of the world, Europe, America, and even Asia, Africa is far behind in terms of industrialization. If you look at the industrial sector in Africa today, quite a lot of activities, or the industrial sector is likely powered by fossil fuel type energy sources, likely because of their availability and even cost effectiveness, as it were. And the question everybody that comes to mind is, given this unique or peculiar situation in Africa, today, can renewable energy sources power huge industrial complexes or projects to transform Africa? The other point is around cost effectiveness. If Africa decides to decarbonize today, what is the future of Africa in terms of industrialization? Because the sense that everybody believes that a major source or option to catalyze any economy in terms of industrial or structural change will actually require industrialization. There are questions around how to Africa power its industrial sector in the continent. Then the last point I want to talk about is technology. We look at Africa today, everybody talks about renewable energy transition. Africa is actually behind in terms of the flow of technology, this type of technology to Africa, largely because of one, intellectual property right restrictions, and even the volume of foreign direct investments from outside the continent to develop in sectors that are tailored into that are designed to develop renewable energy power sources. Then the last point I'm trying to summarize. Then the last point is also around timing. Everybody talks about just transition. I see countries making proclamation and pledges to say they want to achieve net zero by 2050, some say 2030, 2060. The question is Africa ready? Will Africa run on these timelines? Partly because as we speak today, Africa even lacks capacity. For instance, you look at the carbon market in Africa today, there are questions you ask, does Africa have the market infrastructure, enabling regulations to even take advantage of carbon pricing and other related activities that are required to support the decarbonization agenda? There's quite a lot of issues that if we bring it back home to the continent of Africa, there are important questions clearly that are largely unanswered. We hear the narrative, it's fine, but Africa is still a major impact point on all fronts. Thank you.
I think actually, Moataz, you're actually well suited to answer the issues very
Yeah, so a lot of things have been mentioned. Let me send a quick message to the students first. Whenever you hear about statistics and averages, you need to ask what is the standard deviation. Because it really gets to the granularity of things. Don't believe averages, especially when you talk Africa. Second, I want to really apologize for talking on behalf of Africa, because I really know a lot about Egypt, probably it's North Africa, but Sub-Saharan, I wouldn't claim to be in the right place to defend it in the right way. So I'm really happy that you spoke up for that. The third position is, again, I sincerely believe still in just transition, and just transition also includes fossil fuel. So it means preferential treatment for Africa to continue exporting, to continue exploiting fossil fuels until they get the fair share of the transition benefits. And again, with conditions that fossil fuel change their model, and I think they do. And I know there are experts in the room, they're working very hard on changing the model, decarbonizing, and doing better in terms of getting the business model intact and environmentally. That's probably.
No, thank you. And actually something, all right, going around the room, I just feel this whole thing, the debate about, imperialism dictating deadlines and you saying the time frame and what can we do? So one would even argue, when you have clear strategies or clear deadlines and the calendars or goals, and you don't meet them, where do you stand and how do you, I think sometimes the approach is that you start with a certain deadline, 2030, 2050, be it, and you start making plans. And when they don't work out, you try to do alternative plans, but just doing nothing about it or just talking that it's not going to work, it's self-imposed, is taking away from the benefits that we could reap. I don't know, along the lines of questions you're asking. That's at least where I stand. All right, sir.
Thanks for this nice debate. But, I have a background scientifically more than economically. So unfortunately, it is a romantic idea that we can get rid of oil fossil at all. I take it seriously. And for another issue, it is very important issue also. Up till now, there is no evidence that the renewable energy has no side effect of the environment. I take seriously. I am a scientist. I'm a researcher in the Egyptian Petroleum Research Institute. I know what I do. Also, from donation. As you know, Europe gives Africa billions of euros, but with corruption, the result will become zero. And we all see that since centuries, since the last century. So the problem must be in science. We have to do research to solve our problems, both economically and scientifically, because the output of this will give us reducing the space between Africa and the modern in Europe and USA. Even in China, it is not the same case in the scientific research and development of know-how. They have modernization very accelerate their research in the renewable energy. So we don't need the money, we need technology. It's easy.
For the sake of time, we have time for one question. We do want to, at 2 o'clock is when we have to finish. So you've been very patient. Thank you very much. Thank you for that comment. Go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to raise the point about adaptation. I remember you said a statistic about 98% reduction in climate disasters, but I'm wondering where that is sourced from and what are the details of how it's calculated. Because as we've seen in the news and recent research articles, that there's a lot of hurricanes and unstable weather patterns that we can expect from climate change, and the Great Pacific belt of the conveyor belt of the temperatures that goes around makes weather unstable for countries to adapt to. And regarding adaptation, you raised the point that we have technology like ACs and the heating that makes life easier for people. But regarding people in Africa, they don't have the capability to adapt to this type of technology. We need something that's more stable, that people cannot afford ACs in many places in Africa, and we're still a developing country. So adaptation also is not just regarded around humans. There's a lot of primary resources that African countries need to use, like fishing and farming. And these things cannot really be, we can't work around it with technology. We need to be able to use these resources to make money, especially in African countries. I understand that in the developed world, they don't really, the share of the GDP that comes from these types of activities is very different in comparison. And regarding comparisons as well, you mentioned the point about Singapore and China. But I want to raise the question of work ethic and productivity of the labor, because when we attribute the development of these countries that it's due to fossil fuels, I don't think it's a fair comparison, because the work ethic of the people there and also the point of correlation versus causation does not really indicate that the use of fossil fuels is what led to their development. And especially in African countries, also recent research has shown that the productivity levels of the labor are not really doing so great. So I don't think we can compare it to Singapore and China.
For the sake of time, I'll interrupt you. And again, I think you meant 98 from the deaths, not the.
Yeah, so I'll just try to do it quickly. So yeah, the first one is this, so it's the climate-related disaster deaths. And so that's the International Disaster Database. There are a lot of places, but I have a website, energytalkingpoints.com, if you search climate. Just go there and you'll see the link to that database. It's an international nonpartisan database. One thing with the climate things, I think it's important to just not assume that because we're impacting climate, it's going to be all bad for everyone. We're still in a, first of all, climate, our effects include greening and it also includes warming, and most of the world is still, like even India, I said, has more cold related deaths than heat-related deaths. And when you say things like unstable weather, like that's not the way it works. Weather is not stable. We've had different climates in the planet's history. Life thrived in a lot of them. So just watch out for that bias. And then in terms of the last point about correlation and causation, what I'm saying is that fossil fuels have been crucial for development. So they've been a necessary factor in development. The fact of having fossil fuels doesn't cause it. Just to wrap up, so again, I think this idea of a transition, whether you want to call it just transition, is a really unjust, destructive idea for Africa. We know that using fossil fuels is the key to development. We know that the attempt to get off them is harming even the wealthy world and would be disastrous for Africa. We know that there's not actually a climate crisis. We're safer than ever. We have climate impact, not climate crisis. And so there's a real opportunity right now with the global energy crisis for Africa to stand up and say, we're going to use the best forms of energy for us. We're not going to submit to any of these things. And I believe the rest of the world will crumble. I know people on the stage are not on my side here, but maybe some of you are, and maybe some of you watching are. And if you are, I want to help. So you can reach out to me after this, or you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. And I've been proud to help many Africans stand up in the past, and I would like to help more stand up in the future because all of us depend on you standing up. Thank you.
Sorry, what's your email again?
Alex Epstein, which is EPSTEIN.com.
All right, you know what, let's take it, I have another commitment at 2 exactly, so I'd like to conclude today's session. Apparently the debate on climate can go on for a very long time. I do ask you to take your questions individually with Alex or again, Moataz here. Do you want that to be your closing statement?
Yeah,
or do you,
that's my closing
That's your
statement.
closing statement. Moataz, you have a closing statement?
Yeah, my closing statement is we're talking about an advocacy stance. So it's a conditional agreement. So if we put conditions that are just, that's the advocacy stance. Whether it works or not, that's a different discussion. Because I don't think Africa will stop tomorrow fossil fuel from exports. It will only stop if there is an agreement, and we need to have a proper advocacy stance. And it's not what you're talking about. It's absolutely not. And again, fossil fuel will be part of it. You like it or not, fossil fuel is here to stay. And it's here to stay as part of the energy mix. The debate is whether the fossil fuel will deliver a better model, will better democratize and better decarbonize. It's not about that it will vanish in 2050. That's the math does not add up. Right? And part of the problem is us as consumers. Not only, and they talk about the tier 1, tier 2, scope 1, 2, 3, and it's mostly about scope 3, which is us. So yeah, that's a different discussion.
So as a supply chain professor, scope 3 is where I do most of my work. And I just want to really thank the audience for doing, being great and excellent questions. Thank you, Alex, for being here. Welcome to Egypt, Cairo, and the AUC. Thank you, Moataz, for being, again, one of the lead supporters for the School of Business. Thank you very much. I'd like to conclude this session. And if you want to stop recording, it's a good time. Please take your questions individually. Thank you.